Okay, I'm back again and I'm here to read you chapter 11 in George and Marina, the Duke and Duchess of Kent. This is entitled The Duke and the Gellibrand. We only have 5 more chapters to go, but we're right before the World War II broke out, and also we'll read a little bit on King George VI and Queen Mary's coronation, and also where the Duke and Duchess of Windsor are trying to find their place now that King Edward, David has abdicated. So I'll go ahead and get started. Scarcely had the new year begun when the Duke of Kent found himself at the center of what the press, with its ear for a good royal story, turned into a minor scandal. The interference being that the Prince George was again playing away from home. The episode had started in an apparent innocent moment on January the 1st of that year. That morning, beneath headlines, news that Mussolini was to ban Italian volunteers from joining the Spanish Civil War, and sandwiched between a goodwill message from George VI, the engagement of tennis star Betty Nuthall, and news of the third test in Melbourne. The Daily Express ran an entertaining article about the visit of the Duke and a certain Mrs. Allen to Miss Evelyn Boole at the London Phrenological Institution at Ludgate Circus on Fleet Street. There the pair had their heads read by the elderly Miss Boole, who, by the feeling the contours of a person's head, claimed to be able to reveal their abilities, their characteristics, and their pursuits in which they were most likely to succeed. Miss Boole, who was reported to have been thrilled by her 15-minute reading of a royal head, said afterwards that the Duke of Kent had a very nicely balanced head. I should say a fine quality of brain matter rather than quantity. If he were out in the world looking for a job, he would be best suited for classical or artistic work. In itself, it was harmless stuff. As such, it may have remained and had not the Express asked on its front page the next day. Excuse me. In itself, it was all harmless stuff. As such, it may have remained had not the Express asked on its front page the next day, "Who is Mrs. Allen?" Under a photograph of a dark, sultry beauty, the paper's gossip columnist, William Hickes, provided the answer by telling its readers that she was Mrs. William Allen, wife of a wealthy businessman who was formerly MP for West Belfast and is an authority on the peoples of the Near East. As Miss Paula the Gellibrand, she was London's most beautiful mannequin in 1922 and was painted by many artists. As the Marquis de Casamari, predecessor of Frida Dudley Ward, who, in October 1937, married the Marquis after divorcing her first husband. She became one of the best-known figures in the social circle in which the Duke and Duchess of Kent were moving in. From then on, rumors that Prince George and Mrs. Allen had been one of Cecil Beaton's favorite and often photographed models. They were having an affair, and it was becoming widespread. But on the 16th of January, the Evening Standard's gossip column, the Londoner's Diary, ostensibly in an attempt to put a stop to the stories, declared that the consequences of the couple's visit to Mrs. Evelyn Boole had been ludicrous. To members of the royal family and Mrs. Allen, it was extremely painful. His Royal Highness had been the recipient of a flood of letters, most of them anonymous, describing the occasion in terms of varying from crude innuendo to open accusation. The rumor's latest guise is that in consequence of the Duke's relationship with Mrs. Allen, divorce proceedings have been instituted by her husband. Married in 1932, they did, in fact, divorce in 1939. For the past 3 years, the article went on, and Mr. and Mrs. Bill Allen had been living almost entirely in Ireland. One of their rare visits to London, Mrs. Allen, who'd been a friend of the Duke's since his midshipman days, called at Belcrest Square to see the Duchess and her newly born daughter. It wasn't long before the press tired of its own intrigue, though not before Eton-educated Bill Allen had spoken up for himself in the columns of the Times, and in doing so issued a thinly veiled threat to the perpetrators of the scandal by saying, "Certain individuals who have grown rich upon the ruthless exploitation of other people's lives will find that they have come into conflict with men who are not in such a helpless position as some who've recently been tortured on the wheel of the yellow press." As the episode slipped from mine, so it was replaced by escalating public and media interest in the forthcoming coronation of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth on Wednesday, the 12th of May, 1937. That date had originally been set for the coronation of Edward VIII, and as many of the arrangements were already well in advance, made before his abdication, which pressed the pause button on them, it was decided to leave things as they were. After all, nothing save the man who was now about to be crowned had changed. On coronation morning, as the new king and queen and their two daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, prepared themselves at nearby Buckingham Palace for the long day ahead, George and Marina also woke early. The Duke was to ride as part of the escort behind the immense gold state coach that had been built for George III in 1962, in which George VI and Queen Elizabeth would travel to and from Westminster Abbey, where over 30 coronations had taken place in its long history. And he was helped into a ceremonial naval uniform. Next door, Marina, who in the words of Edward Mullinock ranked with Empress Eugenie among the world's outstanding leaders of fashion, put on a slender gown of gold tissue. Embroidered with front-line sequin feathers, George, as the king's brother, would take part in the coronation ritual by swearing fealty to his sovereign, while Marina, sitting between the Duchess of Gloucester and the Countess of Strathmore, the Queen's mother, watched the proceedings from the royal gallery near the high altar. Just 3 weeks later, on the other side of the channel, another small and altogether more private royal ceremony took place. At the Chateau de Candé, near Tours in the Loire Valley, on Thursday, the 3rd of June, the Duke of Windsor and Wallis Simpson were married. Almost every newspaper had run a leader of good wishes. Chips Cannon noted in his diary. The Times, however, refrained. It is, of course, an organ of the Archbishop of Canterbury, the meddlesome Dr. Cosmo Gordon Lang, and he is the power behind it. I think it is disgraceful, the treatment of Duke of Windsor by the present government. It has hurt the institution of royalty far more than ever the Duke of Windsor did himself by the abdication. Younger members of the royal family felt much the same way, echoing the views of Lady Iris Mountbatten, the late Earl of Harewood, elder son of Mary, the Princess Royale, recalled in his memoirs. It's hard for the younger among us not to stand in amazement at the moral contradiction between the elevation of code of duty on the one hand, and on the other hand, denial of central Christian virtues, forgiveness, understanding, and family tenderness. For some time, David had hoped that his brother George would be able to travel to France to act as his best man. In reality, it was a vain and naive hope. As the Home Secretary, Sir John Simon, advised the king, if any members of the royal family were to attend the wedding, it would be regarded and represented as accepting the future Duchess for all purposes into the royal circle. And if, for example, it is desired to discourage the Duke and the Duchess from returning to this country, absence from the wedding could be indicative of a desire to maintain a certain aloofness. George, like Harry Gloucester, did send David and Wallace a wedding present, while Mary, together with Bertie and Elizabeth, telegraphed their best wishes. Otherwise, there was nothing. Well, not quite nothing. On the eve of his wedding, the incredulous bridegroom received a letter from the king advising him that Wallace would not be granted the style and rank of Royal Highness. What that meant, in effect, was George VI and his ministers were giving David, as Duke of Windsor, something he had suggested and been denied as king, a morganic marriage. Though no members of the royal family attended David's wedding, there was hardly one of them who did not want to hear every detail from Baba Metcalfe, who had been one of the 15 or so personal guests at the Chateau de Candé, and whose husband Fruity had acted as the Duke of Windsor's best man in place of Prince George. The King and Queen, Prince George, and Princess Marina wanted to know everything, she said, but after I told them, the subject was never mentioned again. Another invitee that June, though not as a guest on the day itself, was Cecil Beaton, who had been asked to photograph David and Wallace in their wedding finery. The former king in his mourning suit and the former Miss Simpson, she had reverted to her maiden name Warfield by deed poll less than a month before, in her soft blue crepe de soie dress and jacket, designed by the Paris-based American couture, who, by combining his first and last names, Maine and Bocher, became the famous Maine Bocher, or Maine Boker, however that's pronounced. But while the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, like the Duchess of Gloucester, were among his many sitters, Beaton yearned to photograph the Duchess of Kent, Wallace's only equal when it came to chic and style, and whom he admired. The cool, classical features in a perfect oval head held high on a straight column of neck, the topaz eyes, the slightly tilted smile, the apricot complexion, and the nut-brown camp of flat silken curls. Marina had already said for several other celebrated photographers, notably Dorothy Wilding, Horse, Harlot, and Bazzano, and she had been painted by Philip de Laszlo and Savely Sorin. But Beaton had yet to receive a summons. When it finally came during the summer of 1937, he was jubilant. Of their first sitting, he wrote breathlessly, "The Duchess looked excessively beautiful in a huge brown tulle crinoline, much like a Queen Anne window blind or a lampshade, with old-fashioned jewelry. She looked like a Winterhalter painting, and it was thus that she was photographed, slightly nervous at first and very royal, with her deep clipped accent voice, but soon she was as pliable as any sitter I have ever had, and we made many jokes and got along splendidly. It was the start of a warm and lifelong friendship during which Beaton would photograph Marina and her family on numerous occasions. Later in life, he would recall the many photographic sessions in the garden at Coppens with her husband and children, and at the studio when she would arrive with a picnic lunch basket and boxes containing Greek national dress and her formal gown complete with orders and decorations. In July, the Duke and Duchess of Kent were preparing for their summer holiday. For Marina, a few days with Eddie and 7-month Alexandra at Bloody Point, a converted Coast Guard station at Shingle End near Sandwich in Kent, would proceed a visit by car to Germany. There she and George would stay with Toto and Wooly, whose second child, Helena Marina Elizabeth, had been born that May, before going on to friends in Landshut, Poland, and ending up, as usual, with Olga and Paul at their home in Yugoslavia. On July 27th, Marina, casual but elegant in a polka dot dress, light blouse jacket, and two-tone shoes and gloves, left Belgravia Square with her children for Shingles End. En route, her car was involved in a serious collision with another. Miraculously, no one was injured. Though badly shaken, Maria gathered up a rug and spread it out in a field where she helped comfort the family. The holder of a nearby coffee stall had rushed to their assistance, and at the Duchess's request, had telephoned for a relief car to collect them. 4 months later, in a profoundly tragic event that foreshadowed one that was to occur in not dissimilar circumstances in 1942, the royal family was devastated by the loss in an air crash of Marina's first cousin and the future Duke of Edinburgh's sister. Cecile, hereditary Grand Duchess of Hesse by Rhine, her husband. The hereditary Grand Duke George Donatus, Don as he was known, their two young sons, Ludwig and Alexander. Don's mother, the widowed Grand Duchess Eleanor, the children's nurse, a family friend, and two main air crew. Making the loss of the family even more unbearable was the discovery of the tiny body of a newborn son lying next to his mother, Cecile. The tragedy happened while the Grand Ducal family was en route to London for the marriage of Don's younger brother, Prince Louis, and Margaret Geddes, the only daughter of Sir Auckland Geddes, a former British ambassador to the United States, and his wife, Isabella. 4 days ahead of the wedding, which was to have taken place at St. Peter's, Eaton Square on 20 November, in the presence of most of the royal family, the Grand Ducal party left Frankfurt to fly to Croydon Aerodrome aboard a 3-engine Junkers Ju-52 aircraft of Sabena Airways. At Steen, near Ostend, 1 hour after takeoff, the aircraft encountered a sudden dense fog that had drifted in from the sea. Despite the fact that visibility was down to just 20 feet, it is believed, and the subsequent Belgian inquiry into the crash suggested, that the pilot was attempting to land at Ostend because the heavily pregnant hereditary Grand Duchess had gone into labor. But as the plane descended, it clipped the top of a brickworks chimney, and as one of the wings and one of the engines were ripped off the aircraft, plummeted into flames and into the brickworks below. There were no survivors. The wedding of Louis and Margaret, which had already been postponed by the death in October of the prince's father, the Grand Duke Ernest Ludwig IV, brother of the last Russian Tsarina Alexander and of Ella, Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna, was brought forward by 3 days and in an air of funeral gloom. It took place quietly at St. Peter's early on the morning of the 17th of November. The following February, George and Marina were holidaying at St. Anton with Willie and Toto when they received word from Athens that Prince Nicholas, who had returned to Greece 3 months earlier and who had become unwell soon afterwards, was dying of arterial sclerosis. Perhaps because Marina disliked flying, she, Willie, and their husbands caught the night train from Munich. Time lost as a result of the longer rail journey meant that 2 of the prince's 3 daughters were not with him when he died at Hotel Grand Bretagne on 8 February. When en route, the train stopped at Belgrade. Prince Paul was there to meet it. It was he who had the sorry task of telling Marina and Elizabeth that during the night their father's condition had grown worse, and that shortly after a priest had administered extreme unction. Prince Nicholas whispered to his wife and to his eldest daughter, "I'm happy to die in my own beloved country," and had then slipped into a coma. Prince Nicholas was remembered by Chips Channon as a gentle, dreamy gentleman, particularly devoted to the late George V, who was his first cousin. To him, he was in the habit of sending naughty stories and doubtful limericks, for the late king had a racy mind, and like a vulgar joke so long as the point was obvious. Upon their arrival in Athens, the Duchess of Kent and Countess Toring went straight to his parents' suite at the Grand Bretagne, and with their mother and sister sat by their father's body for 15 minutes. 4 days later, following a lying in the state in the Metropolitan Cathedral, during which thousands queued to pay their respects, the 65-year-old prince was given a state funeral before his remains were borne on a flag-draped, horse-drawn carriage to Tatooine, where he was buried near the graves of his parents. For the first 5 or 6 months of her widowhood, Princess Nicholas was taken care of by Princess Olga. Eventually, having decided to settle permanently in Athens, the princess found a comfortable suburban villa, and there, becoming increasingly eccentric and surrounded by a number of pet cats, she remained until her own death almost 20 years later. In the 3 years since her marriage, the Duchess of Kent, as a working member of the royal family, had accepted 2 presidencies: the YWCA Central Club for Women and Girls, and Alexandra Rose Day, the fundraising charity which her great-aunt Queen Alexandra had established in 1912. She had also become patron of the Central School of Speech and Drama and the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson Hospital. Over the next quarter of a century, as patron or president, she would become actively involved with a further 66 diverse organizations that included the PDSA, People's Dispensary for Sick Animals, the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, the Anglo-Hellenic League, the Old Vic Theatre, Queen Victoria Seamen's Rest, the Seamen's Mission of the Methodist Church, the Army Winter Sports Association, the War Widows Guild of Australia, the Royal Alexandra and Albert School, and the All England Lawn Tennis Club at Wimbledon. For his part, the Duke of Kent was no less popular among the communities he served, in an official capacity, trying, as he put it, to gain a real appreciation of his country's problems by personal contact. It was a recognition of his brother's achievements, and no doubt in tribute to the days when they were called the foreman and the factory inspector, that George VI invited the Duke to become the 11th Governor General of Australia, in succession to the first Earl of Gowrie, who had held the post for a record of 9 years. George's appointment was to take effect from November 1939, and to that end, he set about making enthusiastic plans, relinquishing the lease on 3 Belgrave Square, arranging to ship some of his and Marina's furniture out to Government House in Canberra, and again selecting color schemes, furnishing fabrics, and so on, with which to revolutionize the look of their new and even more impressive home. In her biography of Princess Marina, Stella King wrote, "Curtains, hangings, and tailored covers without traditional flounces were sent from England. The Duke chose oatmeal-colored silk tweed curtains, pale blue satin-covered sofas and chairs, and white Grecian rugs, which pleased the Duchess. The Duke also ordered £5,000 worth of household linen, which he paid for himself, and included peach-colored silk sheets edged with satin at £50 a pair." The Australians themselves seemed delighted by the Duke of Kent's appointment. "It is the greatest compliment to the throne can pay to the Australian people," said the Sydney Sun. While at home, Winston Churchill considered it a masterstroke of imperial policy. Only Marina winced at the prospect of living on the other side of the world, so very far away from her family, in a country that was not then noticed for its gentility or culture. Indeed, if Australians were as eager to know her as contemporary reports suggest, Marina was hard put to return the compliment. In the event, world affairs put an end to the Kent's plan. On 3 September, only 2 months before they were due to leave England, the Duchess was listening to the wireless in the music room at Coppin's when it was announced that Britain was again at war with Germany. And that's the end of that chapter. So